recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 107 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, folks, you are going to have yourself a whole lot of fun. We're going to talk about pulling exercises. Are these things the devil? When should you program pulling? Do you ever need to program pulling? Stay tuned. We're going to talk about reaching. Which directions can you reach to effectively improve movement capabilities in the upper body? I'll give you the answer. And last but not least, we're going to talk about stacking during the big lifts. I'm talking squats, I'm talking deadlifts, I'm talking all types of wild and crazy stuff. That's what's on docket tonight because these have been questions that have been asked by the people. They'll be answered for the people by this people right here, fam recognized fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Tommy. Here's what Tommy has to say. Question for you on lifting. I have zero pull-up skills and want to improve that, but I'm hesitant to try some back strengthening exercises, given that my push to do extension-based strength training years ago has probably contributed to my troubles. Heck, this maybe could be a debrief question for you on the video. In fact, it is. Lat pull downs, face pulls, one-arm dumbbell rows. What sets these apart from extension-based exercises that are generally no-gos, such as band pull-aparts, prone, T's, Y's, and I's? For me specifically, any reason I should avoid either lat pull downs, face pulls, or dumbbell rows? This is a great question. What Tommy is discussing and talking about is basically some of these pulling exercises potentially might be contributing to a reduction of movement capabilities in the upper thorax. Namely, if you're doing this type of stuff at all times, and I exaggerate with that pull, so you're pulling the shoulder blades back and letting the chest come forward, that could, in theory, potentially reduce movement options. The very first thing I want to say in regards to this is there are no bad exercises, period. You could potentially justify any activity under the right circumstances and given the right set of goals. Perhaps the goal is variety because you worked with a client for 10 years and you need to do something else. Well, a face pull is probably not going to kill them. So just consider that when you're talking about these things. That being said, if your goal is to improve movement options, you could justify some of these exercises, in fact, all of these exercises, given what movement limitations someone may have. Let's just go through these step by step. The first one I'm going to look at is pull-ups. When could a pull-up be useful? Well, you can bias a pull-up to be incredibly useful or to drive air into various areas. For example, if you're just simply hanging from a bar at the bottom and you go through a full breath cycle, you engage the lower abs and you breathe in, what that's going to do is that's going to increase bucket handle action of both sides of the thorax. So a pull-up in that case would be incredibly useful if you have someone who's got limitations in that regard. So someone who's potentially a wide infrasternal angle, which if you don't know what a wide infrasternal angle is, the show notes, which will be on zachcouples.com/pulling either today or tomorrow, will point you in that direction. So that's one example of just the pull-up. Now, let's go break that down even further. Let's say you pull chest to bar. Now your shoulder blades are a bit more downwardly rotated, pulled together, so external rotation, adduction. If you breathe in that position, that could encourage pump handle mechanics, assuming that you can keep the lower rib cage positioning that I had mentioned previously. So here you have an exercise that some might demonize, or in this case, Tommy, you're concerned that it might drive more extension-based patterns. When reality, this could actually be a really good move for you, depending on when you perform some breathing. Not necessarily a bad thing if we're just talking about purely movement options. And that being said, if you're trying to increase your pull-up skills, which if that's the goal, one of the best ways to get better at pull-ups is to do pull-ups. So I'll give you a personal example. Tommy, I also suck at pull-ups. I don't know if you can tell. even though I'm ugly and I don't have a personality, I'm bald way before my time, I also am kind of weak. And I wanted to get better at pull-ups. And what I did one summer was just do a bunch of pull-ups. I remember I was working with my boy Eric Otter, who I'll link him in the show notes, one of the smartest peeps I know. And he's like, just do a bunch of pull-ups. He programmed me 25 pull-ups, get them done in however many sets you need to. And I remember the first day I did that set of pull-ups, it took me an hour and 10 minutes to get through all of them. It was crazy. But by the end of the summer, I was repping out 5s with weight. So if you want to get better at pull-ups, you should probably practice pull-ups. Moving on to the next move. So we talked about how pull-ups, and you can also put chin-ups in there, could be useful from improving movement options. What about pull-downs? Really, same mechanics as we talked about with the chin-ups and pull-ups. If you are holding the bar up top and you breathe in there, it's going to improve bucket handle mechanics. If you pull down chest to bar, that could improve pump handle mechanics. If you're doing things unilaterally, then you can get really fancy and sexy. Perhaps you're going to pull down to your side on one side and you got another cable that you're holding up top. Well, now I can really encourage bucket handle on the side where the arm is up, in this case my right arm, which I know it's reversed on Instagram. And then on this side, when I'm getting this down pull, I can actually get some degree of A to P expansion. Let me unpack that a little bit. As I pull the shoulder blade down, I'm going to get pump handle because the shoulder blade is a bit more externally rotated and adducted. But because my humerus is in the 0 to 60 range, which we'll talk about later in the debrief, you actually could get some mid to lower posterior thorax expansion, which if you have someone who's got an external rotation limitation could be incredibly useful. So same exercise, just modifying it a little bit and potentially manipulating when you breathe during that exercise can lead to profound improvements in your movement options. Next move, face pulls. When could that be useful? Let's look at a face pull, and we'll just go one arm. If I start with the thumb down and I'm reaching forward and I breathe in this position, I can get posterior inferior thoracic expansion, so mid to lower expansion. As I go up into the pull position, now the scapula is a bit more upwardly rotated. I'm in an externally rotated position at the humerus, the arm is slightly overhead and abducted. If you're going above 90 degrees, which I encourage you to do so on a face pull, that could be a great move to get anterior-posterior expansion in the thorax. Because I have eccentric orientation of stuff on the front of the chest, I can encourage pump handle mechanics here. And because the scapula is a bit more upwardly rotated, and as I go into higher amounts of upward rotation, that can eccentrically orient stuff on the upper thorax, posterior aspect of the thorax. So rhomboids would be a bit more eccentrically oriented. You could, in theory, get more expansion there. And getting expansion in those particular areas is essential if your goal is to get overhead. So another demonized pulling exercise actually could be incredibly useful when programmed for the right person. Let's move on. One-arm dumbbell rows. I actually love these because one, on the opposite side, you're reaching, so you can drive a bit of trunk rotation. And then let's just talk about on the reaching side. So if my right arm is the reaching arm, and I'm using that to support myself, because that's what you're talking about with a one-arm dumbbell row. Here, because I'm reaching at about 90 degrees, I actually can get some pump handle mechanics based on the position of the scapula, which we'll talk about later. I'll also set myself so I can encourage bucket handle mechanics because this reach allows me to more effectively get abs, improving the bucket handle action. On the rowing side, same thing. Anytime I breathe within the row, if I do it at the bottom of the row where I'm more eccentric in the posterior thorax, I actually will get some degree of pump handle. This has to do with the scapular position. As I pull and retract my shoulder blade, that's also going to allow for more pump handle action. So again, great move for someone who needs expansion in the thorax. Now, I love that you wrote these general no-gos, such as, is that reach compressing dorsal rostral expansion? Dr. Pepper asks. If you're reaching between 60 and 120, yes. I will explain that a bit more when we get to question 3. I should have ordered this a bit better, so I apologize. Or actually, question 2. No-gos, band pull-aparts, prone, T's, Y's, and I's. Personally, I don't really program these exercises because I would rather use the big guns and coach them well, because you just get more muscular activity. Things like band pull-aparts, T's, Y's, and I's are a bit more isolation-based in nature. So I don't program them that often, but you could totally justify programming these activities for certain individuals. And I'll link this video that Bill Hartman did on these moves, if I can find it in the show notes. He did a really good explanation of how you could actually justify these moves, but he also doesn't really program them as well. If I'm in an I, which would be reaching down to the side, that could encourage some pump handle mechanics. The Y position could encourage A to P expansion because you're going overhead, and the T position might actually also encourage some degree of pump handle mechanics. Using these activities could be useful if you have someone who's limited in anterior chest wall expansion. I could also put band pull-aparts there as well, because all of these, especially if you're doing them unilaterally, compress the posterior thorax, which would allow for some expansion in the anterior thorax. Are they the best move for someone who has a compressed posterior thorax? Probably not, unless you're talking about the prone Y, because that would allow for some degree of A to P expansion. But band pull-aparts, T's, and I's might not be the best move. I would like these moves better if they're done unilaterally, because then you can encourage that reach on the opposite side to emphasize lower thorax positioning and encourage good pump handle mechanics. But that being said, I think there are more useful moves that you can utilize. And if you need some useful moves, just check out my YouTube channel, because I'm constantly updating that, which is Zach Couples on YouTube. Summarize your question. Well, actually, let me ask this last little bit. For you specifically, is there any reason to avoid lat pull downs, face pulls, or dumbbell rows? When wouldn't I program these moves if we're talking solely about improving movement options? Lat pull downs are generally a solid move because most individuals need A to P expansion. Now, if you have someone who can't keep lower thorax position as they go into the pull, then potentially that's when a bilateral pull isn't the best move. And you might want to emphasize activities that would push you in that direction. So you don't have lower thorax position, you can't stack, which we'll talk a little bit about later, might not be the best move for you. Face pulls. If you don't have mid to posterior thorax expansion, it might not be the best move. You want to have that base first. Same thing, I could also argue an inability to stack, because if you're going up above overhead and you arch, then you're not going to get the expansion that you desire. Dumbbell rows. This one might not be the best move for someone who has posterior thorax compression. That I might push that individual to more reaching-based exercises. And those would really be the times that I would not recommend doing these types of activities. So to summarize your great question, Tommy, pulling is not the devil. It can be incredibly useful for many individuals depending on where your arm is at during the pull and what time you coordinate your breathing. So anything going overhead would be great for bucket handle as well as A to P expansion in the upper thorax. Anything where you're pulling the shoulder blade back, assuming that you can maintain lower thorax position, is incredibly useful for improving pump handle mechanics. And as for your pull-aparts, Y's, T's, and I's, I usually don't program them, but they might be good moves if we're talking about improving the pump handle mechanics, or if we're talking about the Y, it could be a good move to improve A to P expansion, assuming that you can maintain lower thorax positioning. Great question, Tommy. The next question comes from Alex. Here's what Alex has to say. Do you have a source / did you discuss the 0 to 60 degree shoulder flexion being optimal for posterior expansion in a debrief? This is an awesome question. I've really revamped the reaching component in my seminar, Human Matrix, which we'll talk a little bit about later. It's completely different based on some of the research that I've read, and I'll link that research in the show notes. And actually, Don Newman's kinesiology textbook is a really good resource to talk about scapular mechanics, because that's really where this changes. And you'll also want to look a little bit at Paula Ludwig's research. These are the references in which I'm pulling this from. And in order to determine where we need to reach with individuals, we need to discuss what is happening at the scapula throughout the entire arc of flexion. I can only speak to unloaded variations, but generally the flexion arcs are broken down into 0 to 60 degrees of flexion, 60 to 120, and then 120 to 180, or complete elevation. And by looking at some of these references, the normal resting position of the scapula. Now, obviously, there's some caveats with this because some individuals might have compensatory mechanics going on, and that could potentially influence the scapulohumeral rhythm, which is really what this is about. But the scapula is more internally rotated. It's more upwardly rotated slightly, like maybe 5 to 6 degrees, and with a slight, I believe, anterior tip. So that's your normal resting scapular position. And I think it's like 41 degrees of scapular internal rotation. And a general rule of thumb, if the medial border of the scapula is farther away from the thorax, i.e. scapular internal rotation, you're more likely to get posterior expansion. If the medial border is more compressed against the rib cage, i.e. scapular external rotation, the amount of posterior expansion that you will have will be limited. So with that frame of mind, let's look into scapulohumeral rhythm. So normal resting position of the scap, arm is at the side, 41 degrees of scapular IR. You are going to be more predisposed to get some degree of posterior expansion. In the first 60 degrees of shoulder flexion, there is not much scapular movement. So the scapula is going to be in a more internally rotated position. Thus, 0 to 60 degree reaches, so any type of low reach, and I can link some example of the reaches in the show notes. Any reach in that vector is going to allow for better posterior expansion, in particular posterior inferior expansion of the thorax. So I'm talking T6 to T12. The reason why that is because even though there's some degree of upward rotation, it's not as much as when you're going completely overhead. In this case, the muscles that upwardly rotate the scapula, which would be your lower trapezius, your serratus anterior, are going to be more eccentrically oriented, thus allowing for mid to lower posterior expansion. Because the rhomboids, which run from T2 to T5, are going to be more concentrically oriented because the scapula in this case is closer to being downwardly rotated, the amount of expansion you'll get in the posterior superior thorax is going to be a bit more limited. So if you're going 0 to 60, you're more likely to get posterior inferior thoracic expansion or thorax expansion. How would you know you need that? If you have someone who's limited in humeral external rotation, that's usually the telltale sign. Now let me go up from 60 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion. Now I start to pick up some scapular upward rotation as well as scapular external rotation. Because at all costs, under normal mechanics, the scapula is trying to approximate itself to the rib cage as much as humanly possible. When that's going on, as I externally rotate the scapula and upwardly rotate, now the lower trap, serratus to some degree, becomes more concentrically oriented. I get some degree of eccentric orientation of the rhomboid, but because it's also an external rotator of the scap, it increases compressive forces of the scapula against the thorax. Because of that, from 60 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, there's going to be more limitations in your ability to expand posteriorly. So this range is prime real estate to reinforce anterior expansion. Because if I'm blocking the backside of the thorax, I can increase anterior expansion. Close down the back, open up the front. That's why for a lot of individuals who are narrow infrasternal angles, we encouraged reaching forward for these people because, one, it encourages buckhand handle mechanics, but two, if I'm a narrow infrasternal angle, I likely have pump handle mechanic limitations. Reaching forward in this case, in the quadruped position, would encourage those pump handle mechanics. So 0 to 60, posterior inferior expansion. 60 to 120, you're likely to get more pump handle mechanics. Now, let's get wild and crazy and go 120 to 180. In this position, you have maximal humeral external rotation, which is going to be important for pump handle mechanics because a lot of the muscles on the front of the chest are internal rotators. And you still get increases in scapular upward rotation and external rotation, but the scapula at this point is more oriented in the scapular plane, which is about 45 degrees between abduction and shoulder flexion. It's like a 45-degree angle in that vector. So basically what that means is the scapula is more along the side of the rib cage, meaning that the serratus anterior is going to be the primary upward rotator at this point in the game. So now I have a situation where the serratus is squishing the sides of the thorax, allowing for anterior to posterior expansion, in particular of the posterior superior part of the posterior thorax and in the pump handle. So the pump handle happens because the maximal external rotation of the humerus, that eccentrically orients pectoralis major, thus allowing for you to get the pump handle to go up. And then the reason why you're going to get posterior to superior expansion, or posterior superior thorax expansion, has to do with the eccentric orientation of the rhomboids, which, as I had mentioned before, run from T2 to T5, or potentially T1 to T5 if we're talking about rhomboid minor. So you'll get some degree of expansion there. And that's really how you can direct your reaching now. So 0 to 60, due to some of the mechanics I discussed, is going to be very useful for improving posterior to inferior expansion. 60 to 120 is going to get you more pump handle mechanics. And then 120 to 180 is going to get more pump handle mechanics as well as posterior superior mechanics in the upper thorax, or posterior superior expansion, I should say. And that's really what has been directing my reaching to this point, Alex, which is a bit different from when you attended Human Matrix, because I try to advance, I'm trying to get better every time, and things get refined and more effective. And that's why, folks, if you're like, well, that sounds really cool, but I'd like to see how you apply that, and because I want to improve my movement capabilities, or maybe I have a client who's just not ready, like they want to press overhead, but by golly bows, they just don't have the movement capabilities to do so, and I still want to build fitness for these peeps, and I just don't know what direction I should encourage reaching. Or I want to learn how you coach pulling because I feel like these are good moves, but I just don't know how to do that effectively for my rehab or training clients. That's where Human Matrix comes into play, because we go through all of that. I'm going to be revamping it big time. I'm introducing a ton of new stuff at the one that's upcoming, which is January 25th and 26th in Scotts Valley, California. Please sign up for that because, folks, there's only 3 slots remaining. This thing is going to sell out like your favorite rapper after they get famous. But I totally get why they sell out, so I ain't hating. So that's the first one of 2020, January 25th, 26th, Scotts Valley, California, which is in the Bay Area. It's going to be off the Heezy for Sheezy. April 4th and 5th in Atlanta, Georgia, where the players play. And yes, we'll be riding them things like every day. May 23rd and 24th will be in Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. June 6th and 7th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. August 1st and 2nd in Boston, Massachusetts. Pure. September 12th and 13th in Montreal, Canada. October 3rd and 4th in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And November 7th and 8th in Charlotte, North Carolina. Come on and raise up. Potentially we'll be taking our shirts off, obviously if you're comfortable with that. And if you need the record, where that comes from, I'll link it in the show notes. You probably want to check out P.D. Pablo, Raise Up. It's a really good song, but I hope to see you there at one of them or all of them, because this thing is constantly getting updated. The last question comes from Andy. Here's what Andy has to say. I think my question is, if you keep a posterior pelvic tilt and a thorax stacked on top, so the stack, during the deadlift and the squat, Does this compete against lifting mechanics / technique or support them? Posterior pelvic tilt, stacking during the squat and deadlift. Is this a bad thing? Does it go against mechanics? I would argue no, and here's why. During both of these moves, if your goal is to lift maximal weight, you ideally need to be able to create a substantial amount of intra-abdominal pressure and intrathoracic pressure, and you ought to do so circumferentially. That ensures that the spine is safe, there's minimal movement in the ventral cavity, which would be your thorax, abdomen, and pelvis, and it allows you to move maximal weight. And I'm assuming that's going to be the goal if we're talking about mechanics and techniques, which is where I would argue a lot of people make a mistake when performing these moves. I'm performing a squat and a deadlift, and I create this excessive arch. Well, now you're running into some problems because you're not getting that circumferential expansion in the abdomen as well as the thorax. In fact, I would be creating more compressive forces in the posterior aspect of the body. I would be eccentrically orienting more stuff on the front, and you'd be minimizing the amount of movement options that we would need to perform these movements effectively. Because even though you're creating circumferential expansion, there still should be, well, that should allow some degree of movement options. If I'm compressing everything posteriorly and I'm just creating all of my pressure, allowing intra-abdominal pressure or expansion to occur in the front, i.e. the pump handle mechanism and the guts pushing more anteriorly, well, then you're going to be limiting movement options, one, and you're going to be limiting the amount of pressure you can generate because you only have so much room to be able to push air into the front of the chest and to push the viscera into the front of the abdomen. For that reason alone, I think that you probably need to stack in order to perform these movements effectively. If we're talking about the difference between a squat and a deadlift, a squat, I would argue, should have more vertical displacement of the pelvis, more counter-nutation of the sacrum, and a deadlift should have more nutation of the sacrum and posterior displacement of the pelvis. If you are creating this excessive arch, which a lot of people coach, you limit your ability to do both of those things. One, you won't be able to counter-nutate the sacrum on a squat because you have this excessive arch, so then you're going to displace the pelvis posteriorly, which is more of a hinge. And two, if you are nutating the sacrum already to start, you're going to run out of room sooner and going to have to do some compensatory mechanisms at the spine in order to hit depth, most likely, or at the femurs. So when you see someone who has a super hingy squat, or they have a tremendous amount of lumbar flexion on the deadlift, this is probably not desirable from a mechanics standpoint, one. And two, if the goal is to work particular muscles, you're probably not getting the job done. Your squat is going to be loading a lot more of the knees and the lower back and potentially the hips, which, hips probably aren't a bad thing. But then on the deadlift too, you're probably not going to be loading the back muscles as effectively as you could, or the glutes and hamstrings, because you've taken up slack in them too early in one case. And then two, you're going to be pulling the weight, if I have a lot of lumbar flexion, from an eccentrically oriented spinal erectors, or too eccentric. So it's going to be harder for you to generate tension. So just from a biomechanical perspective, not having the stack during these movements is probably not a desirable thing. Now, are you going to kill yourself by having this excessive arch if that's your goal? And the population who I'm thinking of is powerlifters? Well, probably not. But if you're going to be powerlifting to a high degree, you've likely created some adaptations to allow you to do so. But I do think it would also be useful to encourage some of these stacked-based activities, or squatting or hinging in this manner, just to preserve your movement options. Now, in particular, because there's been a lot of talk on the interwebs about squatting, do I want to keep this stacked position? Is that actual normal mechanics of a squat? And is there evidence to support this? Well, yes, there is actually. There's an article, and I'll link this in the show notes. I believe it's called The Lumbar and Sacrum Mechanics During the Squat, during the back squat in particular, which a lot of peeps love. In this article, they took people who had lifted for about a year, so we're not talking complete newbies, but people who have at least a year lifting experience. These were fit individuals. I believe a lot of them were on their way to being trainers or were trainers. And we looked at their mechanics during a back squat with just the barbell and with 50% of their body weight. So, of course, these are a little bit more on the lower amount of weight side of things, but I still think it's an interesting study. As soon as the bar was put on the backs of these individuals, the lumbar spine became kyphotic. That kyphosis increased as the pelvis dropped towards the ground, and then it reduced on the way up. And what these people concluded who did the study was that coaching an excessive arch during the back squat is likely undesirable because it goes against the normal mechanics that we would see during this movement. So it is normal in a back squat to have some degree of lumbar kyphosis, and I would argue that it's likely safe and necessary to do so. The spine should be able to adapt to a lot of the forces that it's imparted and in all the positions that the spine can achieve. So it is totally safe to squat with a flexed spine and to deadlift with an overly extended spine if you want, if you are prepared to do so and you've done the things necessary to prepare the tissues to tolerate those forces. Each of the lumbar discs, when trained, each one individual, can tolerate 11,000 newtons of force. And elite powerlifters put oftentimes 14 to 16,000 newtons of force throughout the spine. I don't think that any movement is necessarily bad. But if the goal of prescribing these exercises is to load specific tissues, with the squat we're talking quads, glutes, probably hamstrings, and with the deadlift, really the same. You want to do things to maximize your ability to load that stuff. And if you don't have a stacked position where the pelvis is slightly posteriorly tilted and you have an exhaled lower rib cage to allow for some degree of movement options to happen, you're going to negatively impact the length-tension relationships in muscles in the lower body, and you're probably not going to load them as effectively. I'm not going to really load the biceps effectively if I start curling a weight from 115 degrees of elbow flexion. I can't generate as much force curling that same weight if I start from 0 degrees of elbow extension. The ideal is 90. And really, we want our individuals to have all of those options available. And if you are coaching someone to squat or deadlift and you're not encouraging a stacked position, you're minimizing those options and likely minimizing your client's gains. So to summarize, your great question, Andy. Yes, I do coach the stack during a squat and a deadlift during pretty much all variations because it allows for maximization of intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressure. I think that, at least in the squat case, it does encourage normal squat mechanics, which is vertical displacement of the pelvis, kyphosis of the lumbar spine, and counter-nutation of the sacrum. I also think you should be able to maintain that position as you go into a hinge, which is posterior displacement of the pelvis, and because it allows for an appropriate amount of nutation of the sacrum while keeping abtension so you can keep your spine safe. Now, does that mean that having arches is bad? If you're prepped to do so, you're a power lifter and it's game time and you got to try to move maximal weight and that's your only option available, you better be prepped for it and you're probably going to be okay. And I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. I had a blast doing this one. It was a lot of fun. You're probably wondering, well, Zach, this sounds really good, but where do I learn more? Well, I'm glad you asked. Go to zachcouples.com first off. Subscribe to my newsletter while you're there because you're going to get a ton of good stuff. Here's what you're going to get. You're going to get about 5 hours of me lecturing on pain and breathing. You're going to get a free acute to chronic workload so you can safely scissor posture and canister posture, SAG 133. Yes, scissor posture would be like the arch, the canister posture would be more the stack. Good question. So a free acute to chronic workload calculator so you can intelligently progress your clientele to improve their movement options. You will also get what else are you going to get? You're going to get access to weekend goodies every Friday, which will be the coolest things on the interwebs that your boy Big Z finds. You're going to get a free class that teaches you to improve your understanding of normal respiratory mechanics as well as movement mechanics in general. You're going to, I think that's about it. Oh, you'll also get access to like any discounts and products and stuff like that that I release. So please subscribe to the newsletter while you are there. Also, I offer some services to help you wonderful people out. If your toy, you're not moving as well as you like to, or perhaps you're having a hard time getting overhead because you want to overhead press to get some gains, or you are a some last healthy recommendations, or you are a what are you? You're a trainer, or you're a clinician, and you're like, man, I'm trying to coach my people to do this squat effectively, and I can't really get that stack, Zach, and I'm wondering, well, maybe there's something a little bit deeper that I need to dive into, and I need some help. Well, you're looking at the helper right here. What I offer are movement consultations, and with these consultations, we will take you or your clients through some simple movements, find out where they're limited from a movement perspective, and give them easy to execute activities to help maximize their movement options so they can reach their goals faster than ever before. Or perhaps you want to take that to the next level and you're like, that sounds really good. I'd like to also improve my fitness as I'm doing so. Well, we can do that for you as well. That's where online training comes in, because I can take that information and pick exercises that are going to be best fit for you to help you meet your fitness goals. Or maybe you want to learn how to do that with your clientele and you're like, I'm not really sure how to start with doing that. And all this sounds well and good, but how does it apply to my specific population? That's where the mentorship program comes into play. Here, we're going to have a good dialogue back and forth on how to best fit that with you. You're going to have some homework during this so you can apply this stuff most effectively. And it's not going to be me lecturing you, fam. It's going to be a good conversation back and forth where I challenge you with some of your preconceived notions in a healthy and friendly way. And we both work together to help you reach your goals to best help your clientele. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, I'll need you to go to iTunes. I'll need you to go to Stitcher and search the Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There's 106 other debriefs out there. And, the quality of video wasn't always this great. We didn't have 2 camera angles back then. So you might want to just listen to me. And that's where you can find me, on iTunes and Stitcher. And please leave a review so the fam can keep growing. In terms of your social medias, I'm on Facebook /Z Couples. I'm on, of course, that Instagram, baby, Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-P-P-L-E-S. I'm on Twitter. The handle is @ZCouples. And last but not least, I'm on YouTube, which I got a gang of exercises, and I'm trying to actually organize them a little bit. The debriefs will be on there, the sexy video versions where I got 2 camera angles, the finest video, all types of stuff, and I might even add some other stuff beyond that. Who knows? We'll get wild and crazy. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been an amazing audience. I hope you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.